My presentation is on Gerald Gardner and the Wiccan revival in Britain. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to give you general background on Gerald Gardner and Wicca in itself, and then the popularity that his Wiccan practices gained. So this is Gerald Gardner, and he was born in 1884. He grew up in Lancashire, and his family moved to Madeira. He eventually moved to Sri Lanka when he was independent and he learned the tea trade. And then he moved to Malaya, where he was a rubber plantation worker. And that's when he joined the Freemasons as well. By the 1930s, he became an archaeologist. And in 1936, he moved to Europe, where he would stay primarily for the rest of his life. Gardner lived a pretty chaotic life, or at least a life that was never dull, living in both world wars and fighting in them, moving around jobs, and then when he was in London, he would traveled to different places for his archaeology job, primarily to Cyprus, actually. And when he was in places like Sri Lanka and Malaya, he would move to London every once in a while to visit family. So he moved around a lot and did a lot of things with his life. But when he moved to Europe in 1936, his asthma acted up because of the change in climate, and Dr. Gregg, his physician, suggested nudism for him because everyone knows when you have asthma, you treat it with nudism. So that's what he did, and he joined some nudist clubs and got around doing that. And that's when he learned that he was very interested in Wicca and odd religious practices. Because of his interesting upbringing, he was introduced to a lot of different religions, which would later help him and his future practice of Wicca with having kind of a really open mind to what religion was and what it could be. So, beginning this path to Wicca, he first started the Rosicrucian order. Well, he didn't start it, he joined it, sorry. And eventually he moved to the New Forest Coven in 1939, and that's when he first heard the word Wicca, which he recognized as witch, obviously. And before that, he really didn't know that witch paganism, or witchcraft, I guess, was really still out there. And he became very surprised by that, and he decided that he would continue to attend this New Forest Coven, and he eventually joined it and everything. And then he started the Bricketwood Coven, which was his own group that would do their own rituals. He also, in 1946, joined the Ancient British Church, which is basically a church that takes in anybody who conforms to a monotheistic ideology, which I found really fascinating. But he also joined the Ancient Druid Order, which he would take trips to Stonehenge during midsummer and do practices there. And then eventually he met Aleister Crowley in 1947, who is a pretty distinguished figure himself because he founded the religion Thelema, which is another paganistic religion. And Crowley himself appointed him as one of the Ordo Templi Orientis, which are the people who were able to select people and admit people into the Thelema religion. So he was ordained to officially let people into their group. So that was really interesting. But with his own form of Wicca, which was greatly influenced by Freemasonry, which I mentioned he joined in Malaya pretty early on, and then also Druid rituals. So it was kind of his own mix. He gained his first own initiates of Wicca in 1949 to around 50. And later in his life, he became the owner of the Folklore Center of Superstition and Witchcraft Museum in Isle of Man. So he worked in that museum basically for the rest of his life while continuing his ritual practices. But in 1953, he appointed Doreen Valiente as the head priestess in his brick and wood coven. And so basically she was his counterpart in that. And later she would carry on his legacy. So that becomes important as well. And so he popularity really grew among Gardnerian Wicca around 1951 to 54. In 1951, he wrote High Magic's Aid, which is written by Skyer, as you can see on the left, and Skyer was his craft name or his magic name, so the name he would go by during his rituals. And this piece of literature was basically a fictional piece of literature about paganistic rituals. But then after the Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1951, practicing witchcraft was no longer illegal, so he produced what his work called Witchcraft Today in 1954, which really gained traction and made Wicca quite popular. And that's where it started to become kind of reintroduced in Britain. On the right, unfortunately, I can't play it because of the free piece of technology that I'm using to record this. But if you look up, I have it written on the bottom, Rare Gerald Gardner interview at the Witch's Mill, 1957. You can look that up on YouTube. I would encourage you to do so. It's a really interesting piece of a primary source that you can just access really easily. And basically, it's a interview that Gardner did where someone accused him of just having orgies, basically, and he blatantly denies that and says how witchcraft is just a peaceful religious practice. And in that interview, they also bring in a priest and they ask him his opinion on nudism, it's just a really interesting interview, and I would highly recommend you go and watch that because it's really interesting. But he also wrote his Book of Shadows, which you see on the left, and that contained his ritual practices within Wicca. And then these houses are the places in Hillshire where he had his brick and wood coven. And the building on the right, is the building that he would hold his nudist pagan rituals with his group of coven people. So his Gardnerian Wicca also is known as British traditional Wicca, which became really popular in Britain and um, began to gain traction in the 60s, specifically among feminist movements, because they viewed the witch as an independent, powerful woman. So that's when we start to see this paganistic revival in Britain and why specifically Gardnerian Wicca is introduced. Um, Eco activists also tended to go this route of religion because of this idea of Mother Nature and that nature is sacred. And so those two different groups really adopted British traditional Wicca. And it continued into the 70s with the hippie era as Wicca traditions were really popular amongst those groups. And then in the 90s and even today, it continued, and people would call themselves hedge witches, who were people who followed the craft but weren't necessarily in a coven. And their form of Wicca is Gerald Gardner's form of Wicca, technically, because it's known as the British traditional Wicca, and he really paved the way for the paganistic revival in Britain. So his legacy went on, and he started he was awarded the Blue Plaque, which was appointed by the Doreen the Valiant Foundation and Center for Pagan Studies. So that's found in his home in Highcliffe in 2014, which noted him as the father of modern witchcraft. And then he also, oddly enough, was on Ripley's Believe It or Not, and they made a wax figure for him that you can see on the right. So that's a very brief overview of Gerald Gardner's history and his influence in the Wiccan revival in Britain.